What if I told you that in 1930s Florida, a man fell in love with a dying woman and refused to let death take her away? What if I told you that love, in his mind, was stronger than decay, stronger than time, and stronger even than God? This is not a ghost story. It's a tale of a real man named Carl von Cosel, a German-born radiologist who claimed he could save the woman he loved from death itself. When he couldn't, he decided to keep her anyway. In the quiet town of Key West, Carl was known as eccentric but brilliant. He worked in the local hospital, often rambling about his visions, about a dark-haired woman who appeared to him in dreams. His destined soulmate, he said. To those around him, it was the harmless fantasy of an old romantic. But in 1930, when a beautiful 21-year-old woman named Elena de Hoyos arrived at the hospital, Carl claimed he had found her. Elena was radiant, lively, and dying. Tuberculosis had already begun its merciless work, stealing her breath day by day. Carl devoted himself to her care with obsessive tenderness. He brought her gifts, jewelry, perfumes, even medical machines he built himself. But beneath his gestures of love simmered something darker, an obsession that would soon defy every moral, legal, and human boundary imaginable. When Elena died in October 1931, the hospital mourned. Carl did not. He refused to believe she was gone. "Death is only a door," he wrote later, "and love knows the way through." He paid for her funeral himself, built a mausoleum, and visited every night. For 2 years, neighbors saw the flicker of a lantern among the graves. They whispered, but no one dared ask why a man spent his nights with the dead. Inside that tomb, Carl spoke to Elena as if she were alive. He played music for her, read poetry, and promised to bring her back. He claimed she spoke to him too, in whispers, in dreams, in the rustle of night wind through the cemetery. And then, one night, he acted. He broke into her tomb, removed her body, and carried her home. For 7 years, Carl lived with Elena's corpse, dressing her, washing her, filling her decaying skin with wax and silk. He slept beside her, spoke to her, loved her. To him, it wasn't madness. It was devotion. To everyone else, it became one of the most disturbing love stories in recorded history. For years, no one in Key West knew what Carl von Cosel had done. His rented home, a weather-beaten shack near Flagler Avenue, became a place of mystery. Curtains always drawn, a sweet, chemical smell leaking from the cracks, strange music drifting through the night air, an organ tune that neighbors claimed came from no instrument they had ever heard. Inside, Carl had recreated a fantasy. He dressed Elena in wedding gowns, surrounded her with flowers, candles, and perfumes to mask the stench of death. Her eyes were glass, her face reconstructed from wax and plaster. Wires held her bones in place. Silk stuffed the gaps where flesh had turned to dust. To him, it wasn't a corpse. It was a bride suspended in eternal sleep. Every morning, he spoke to her softly, as if she would wake. He sang to her in German, whispered prayers, and brushed her hair. He even built a crude airship model above her bed, claiming he would one day fly her to the stratosphere, where cosmic radiation could restore her life. To the outside world, Carl became increasingly reclusive. He quit the hospital. He spoke to no one. He told acquaintances he was caring for a sick woman at home, his wife. But those who passed by his window late at night swore they saw a pale figure lying in his bed, and a shadow sitting beside it, humming to himself. Carl kept meticulous records of his treatments. He mixed preservatives with formaldehyde, replaced rotting organs with rags soaked in disinfectant, and inserted glass tubes where decomposition had hollowed the body. Each experiment, he believed, brought him closer to resurrection. He wasn't trying to defile Elena. In his mind, he was trying to save her. He wrote letters in her name, whole pages filled with delicate handwriting. "I am happy now, my beloved Carl. I feel your love, even through the sleep of death." Whether he forged them or truly believed Elena's spirit dictated them didn't matter. He needed her voice to justify what he had become. But the illusion couldn't hold forever. By 1940, nearly 7 years after her death, the neighbors' curiosity turned to suspicion. Children whispered of a doll in the old man's house. A local boy claimed he had seen Carl dancing with something that didn't move. It wasn't until Elena's sister, Florinda, grew alarmed by the stories that the truth came out. She visited Carl unannounced, and what she saw inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. The day Florinda discovered the truth, the air in Key West felt unusually heavy, a tropical stillness before the storm. She had come to confront Carl after hearing rumors that her sister's body was missing from the tomb. He greeted her at the door with a smile, his hair white and wild, his eyes glittering with something between pride and insanity. "Come in," he said. "Elena has been waiting for you." Florinda hesitated, stepping into the dim parlor filled with the scent of decay masked by perfume. The room was lined with photographs of her sister, alive, radiant, beside newer images that made Florinda's stomach twist. In them, Elena was pale and lifeless, dressed in lace, her hand held by Carl as if they were newlyweds. Then she saw it, the figure lying on the bed, perfectly still under a lace veil. At first, she thought it was a mannequin. But when the veil shifted with the breeze, the truth clawed its way into her mind. Her sister's face, waxy, hollow, patched with glass eyes and painted lips, stared back. The body was preserved, but barely. The air carried that sweet, rotten smell that no perfume could hide. Florinda screamed. Carl rushed forward, panicked, insisting she didn't understand. "She's alive in spirit," he pleaded. "I have brought her back. She speaks to me. She loves me still." His voice cracked under the weight of delusion, his trembling hands reaching for her like a man drowning in his own fantasy. The police arrived hours later, guided by Florinda's trembling testimony. What they found inside that small wooden house would make headlines across the world. Elena's remains, dressed in silk and lace, adorned with flowers, were carried out into the sunlight, a grotesque parody of a bride. Carl von Cosel stood nearby, weeping silently, whispering her name as if she could still hear him. The autopsy revealed what the public wasn't prepared to believe. The body had been meticulously preserved with wax, rags, and glass eyes. Metal wires and coat hangers replaced bones. Her skin had been rubbed with wax and plaster. He had inserted tubes where flesh had decayed, filled cavities with silk, and even applied makeup to restore her beauty. When Carl was taken into custody, he didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost proud. "I loved her more purely than anyone else could," he told reporters. Death was only an obstacle, not the end. The courts charged him with maliciously disturbing a grave. But there was a cruel twist. The statute of limitations had expired. Carl von Cosel walked free. The crowd that once whispered about the mad old man now stared in silence, unsure whether to hate him, pity him, or fear him. Freedom did not return Carl von Cosel to the world of the living. It only deepened his descent into a world of fantasy. When he stepped out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed him like vultures, eager to capture the mad doctor who had slept beside a corpse for 7 years. But Carl smiled for the cameras. He adjusted his white linen suit and declared, "I have done nothing shameful. Love does not end with death." The public's fascination was morbid and divided. Some saw him as a deranged monster, a man so twisted by grief that he became unrecognizable to reason. Others, disturbingly, viewed him as a tragic romantic, a broken soul who defied mortality in the name of devotion. In the shadow of the Great Depression, when loss had become a universal wound, Carl's madness almost seemed poetic to some. Yet when the crowd dispersed and the headlines faded, he returned to isolation. He settled in a decaying shack outside Zephyrhills, Florida, far from the graveyard of his past, where whispers could not reach him. There, surrounded by dust and relics, he began to rebuild his obsession. On an old workbench, beneath yellowed photographs of Elena, he molded wax and plaster, recreating her body from memory. Her eyes, 2 marbles of blue glass, glistened under candlelight. He called this creation his spiritual wife. Neighbors would later claim they heard him talking to her late into the night, sometimes singing in German, other times whispering softly, as if reciting prayers to the dead. But when questioned, Carl would only smile and say, "She visits me. You do not understand. She is not gone. She never left." Despite his exile, Carl wrote endlessly. Journals filled with letters to Elena, scientific theories about preserving the soul, and sketches of flying machines that he claimed would one day take them both to the heavens. His delusion fused love, death, and science into one obsessive creed. He described himself not as a grave robber, but as a rescuer of beauty. In his writings, he claimed that Elena had appeared to him in dreams after her burial, asking him to free her from the grave. He said she spoke of loneliness, of the cold earth that surrounded her, and begged him to keep her warm. These visions, whether born of madness or guilt, became the foundation of his reality. The townsfolk who once vilified him began to forget. Decades passed. The house, once filled with whispers of the dead, grew silent. But inside, the candles still burned, illuminating the lifelike figure of Elena he had sculpted, the image of a woman who had never grown old, never decayed, never denied him. When Carl von Cosel died in 1952, he was found lying beside that wax figure, arms wrapped around it, as if guarding his secret one last time. The townspeople whispered that, somehow, he had reunited with her at last, not in life, not in death, but in the madness between the two. Long before Carl von Cosel ever laid eyes on Elena, his obsession had already been born, not from love, but from prophecy. As a boy in Dresden, Germany, he was haunted by a recurring dream. In it, a dark-haired woman with olive skin and deep, sad eyes appeared to him, dressed in white, standing by a sea of mist. She would whisper in a language he could not understand, then vanish, leaving him with one burning belief, that she was his destiny. He would later claim this vision was not fantasy, but fate, a glimpse of the woman he was meant to love, no matter the cost. As Carl grew older, he pursued science and medicine, fascinated by the mechanics of life and death. Yet beneath the sterile instruments and rational theories, he clung to the supernatural. He studied ancient Egyptian preservation, spiritualism, and reincarnation. He claimed to communicate with spirits through electrical vibrations, convinced that death was not an end but a veil, one that could be pierced by devotion and ingenuity. By the time he emigrated to America, the world had already branded him eccentric. He worked odd medical jobs, often dismissed for erratic behavior and grandiose ideas. He would tell co-workers of his mysterious bride-to-be, the woman from his dreams, describing her with unnerving precision. "She waits for me," he would say, "and I will know her when I see her." When he first encountered 21-year-old Elena de Hoyos in the tuberculosis ward of Key West, he stopped mid-step. To him, it was no coincidence. The woman from his dreams now stood before him, breathing, fragile, mortal, his destiny made flesh. To Elena, Carl was simply another doctor, older, peculiar, but gentle in his manner. To him, she was everything. He began to visit her daily, bringing gifts, flowers, jewelry, and bizarre contraptions meant to heal her illness. He constructed a small electric machine he claimed could reinvigorate her failing lungs, and read her poetry he had written decades before, verses addressed to the woman from his dreams. Her family noticed his fixation and grew uneasy. He spoke not of curing her, but of saving her, not from disease, but from death itself. He began to promise her immortality, whispering that she would never leave him. Whether out of fear, gratitude, or resignation, Elena endured his visits. But tuberculosis is relentless. In 1931, her lungs collapsed, and her frail body surrendered to the disease. Her final words, recorded by her mother, were a soft apology for being unable to smile for her doctor anymore. Carl did not attend the funeral. He attended the graveyard instead. He stood among the mourners, watching as the earth swallowed the only woman he believed he was ever meant to love. And in that moment, he made a silent vow that death would not take her from him. After Elena's burial, the Key West cemetery became Carl's sanctuary. Every night, under the veil of darkness, he would walk the winding paths until he reached her tomb, a small white mausoleum he had built with his own money. To others, it was an act of generosity. But in truth, it was an obsession carved in stone. Inside that marble chamber, he placed her photograph, letters, and candles that he would relight each evening. He told the groundskeeper he was tending to her spirit, yet even the dead seemed restless in his presence. Witnesses later recalled how he would speak softly into the grave, pausing as if listening for a reply. Some nights, the cemetery workers heard music coming from the tomb, faint violin melodies drifting through the air. He said she visited him there, her voice echoing from beyond, begging him not to leave her alone in the cold. Whether these were hallucinations or the product of grief, no one could tell. Months turned to years, and Carl's nightly rituals became stranger. He began bringing instruments, medical tools, and vials of preservative chemicals. He claimed he was researching a new method to halt decay, a way to preserve beauty against the cruelty of time. But beneath his trembling hands was not science, it was denial. He could not accept that the woman from his dreams had slipped beyond reach. And so, one April night in 1933, Carl broke the lock on her tomb and carried her body home. Neighbors saw him that night, struggling under the weight of a bundle wrapped in cloth. They assumed it was equipment. No one questioned the odd old man who muttered to himself in German. Inside his home, Carl laid the bundle on a bed draped in lace and flowers. When he unwrapped it, the air turned thick with the stench of decay. But he did not recoil. Instead, he whispered, "My love, I've brought you home." For the next 7 years, he dedicated himself to preserving her. He replaced her skin with silk cloth, her bones with wires, her hair with wigs he collected from salons. He inserted glass eyes, painted her lips crimson, and dressed her in a wedding gown. He used plaster and wax to restore her face to its former beauty, the image that had once smiled at him from a hospital bed. By candlelight, he would talk to her, sing to her, and sleep beside her. He told visitors that she was still alive, simply too weak to be seen. And Carl's small home became a museum of delusion. Every corner was devoted to Elena, her photos, her clothes, the letters he wrote her daily. He called it the Temple of Love. To him, the house was no longer a decaying shack in Key West. It was a sacred space where science and devotion had conquered death itself. The air inside was heavy with the scent of formaldehyde and roses. A gramophone played waltzes on repeat, filling the silence that had long swallowed him whole. But reality seeped in through the cracks. The humid Florida air corroded the wires that held her limbs together, and insects began to find their way beneath her dress. Carl, undeterred, wrapped her in layers of gauze soaked in disinfectants, perfumed her with oils, and even filled her abdominal cavity with rags to maintain her form. He documented every change, noting it down like a scientist. But these were not experiments. They were rituals. He would read her poetry by candlelight, describing worlds where they would fly together in his homemade airship, Elena's dream. He believed her soul hovered above him, tethered by love. He claimed they shared thoughts, that her spirit still answered him when he asked for forgiveness. His madness became a language only he could speak, one built from grief, faith, and a desperation to make the dead live again. Outside, the town of Key West had long forgotten her name. But inside that house, Elena never aged, never decomposed, frozen forever in the fantasy of a man who refused to let her go. By 1939, 7 years after her death, the illusion began to crumble. Visitors who came by, delivery men, curious neighbors, noticed a sweet, decaying smell and strange mannequins in the window. Carl would greet them cheerfully, claiming his wife was unwell and resting. But behind the bedroom door lay the truth, a corpse dressed in bridal white, hair brushed, lips painted, body crumbling beneath lace and silk. The gossip reached the Hoyos family. One of Elena's sisters, Florinda, decided to confront him. One evening, she arrived unannounced. Carl welcomed her with unsettling warmth and insisted she see how well Elena was doing. When he opened the door, Florinda froze. There, in the dim light, stood her sister, or what was left of her, staring with glass eyes, her hands bound with ribbon, her mouth shaped into a wax smile. Florinda screamed. The illusion shattered. Carl tried to calm her, insisting that Elena's spirit lived with him and that their marriage had been blessed in dreams. He even claimed the body was not real, just a life-size effigy. But when police arrived the next day, the truth could no longer be denied. Under the glow of flashbulbs and horror, the secret of Carl von Cosel's love was revealed to the world. The discovery of Elena's body spread through Key West like wildfire. Within hours, reporters, doctors, and townsfolk gathered outside Carl's crumbling cottage. Police escorted him out, while forensic investigators entered the Temple of Love. What they found was beyond imagination. The once beautiful Elena de Hoyos had been transformed into a grotesque mannequin of death, her skin reconstructed with wax and silk cloth, her bones held together with piano wire. Her face was covered in layers of plaster and rouge, a parody of life shaped by obsession. When authorities questioned Carl, he spoke calmly, even proudly. He admitted to taking Elena's body, but he denied wrongdoing. To him, it was not desecration, it was devotion. "I loved her," he said softly, "and love never dies." He explained that his work had preserved her beauty, that his inventions had kept her spirit near. His words carried the sincerity of a man who could no longer tell the difference between love and delusion. In the morgue, doctors examined the remains, stunned by what they found: wax, glass eyes, wire frames, and traces of silk where flesh once was. The public was horrified, yet morbidly fascinated. Crowds lined up to glimpse the corpse bride, displayed briefly before burial, turning tragedy into spectacle. The newspapers labeled him the real-life Frankenstein, a necromancer of love and death. But even as the headlines mocked him, something darker lingered beneath the laughter, a question no one dared to ask aloud. Was Carl von Cosel a monster, or simply a man consumed by loneliness too deep to survive? The trial that followed was surreal. Carl appeared in court wearing his usual white suit, calm, smiling, even charming. He waved to the crowd, certain that the world would understand. He claimed that Elena had agreed to marry him after death, that her ghost had visited him nightly, pleading not to be left alone in the cold earth. His statements were so strange, so filled with passion and poetry, that some spectators wept instead of recoiling. Doctors testified about his mental state. Psychiatrists debated whether he was insane or simply delusional from years of isolation and grief. The charges, grave robbery and desecration, were serious, yet legal complications arose. The statute of limitations had expired. The law could not punish what had been hidden too long. Carl von Cosel walked free. But freedom meant nothing to him without Elena. He returned to solitude, haunted and pitted. The public soon forgot, but the myth remained. The tale of the man who could not let go, who turned love into madness and devotion into decay. Years later, when Carl was found dead in 1952, his body lay beside a wax effigy of Elena, his final, silent companion. The man who could not accept death had finally met it, wrapped once more in the illusion he built from love, loneliness, and denial. After Carl's release, Key West remained divided. Some saw him as a lunatic, a ghoul who violated the sanctity of death. Others, disturbingly, viewed him as a tragic romantic, a man too pure for a cruel world. Letters poured in from across the country, women offering sympathy, others proposing marriage. Newspapers sensationalized his story as the man who loved beyond death, reducing a tale of obsession and decay into a gothic love fantasy. In a time when death was sanitized and hidden from sight, Carl had dragged it back into the light, dressed in lace, perfumed with roses, and kissed as though it still breathed. But behind the newspaper headlines was a darker reality. Carl began to drift further into his private delusion. Isolated and jobless, he built a new home, small, cluttered, and surrounded by the remnants of his obsession. Inside, he crafted a second effigy of Elena, this time more detailed, more human, and even more unsettling. To his few visitors, he spoke as though she were alive, addressing the wax figure softly, offering her tea, singing the same lullabies he once played on his organ. The townsfolk whispered that he still visited Elena's grave by moonlight, leaving flowers and notes written in blood. Whether these stories were true didn't matter. They fed the legend. Carl von Cosel had become something larger than life. Part scientist, part necromancer, part ghost himself. In his eyes, he had conquered death. To everyone else, he had drowned in it. By the 1940s, Carl's story had spread beyond Florida. Psychologists, criminologists, and priests all debated the meaning of his actions. Was it love? Madness? A symptom of the human need to defy mortality? The case became a mirror for society's darkest curiosities. People who read about him often recoiled, and yet could not look away. The boundary between love and horror, devotion and decay, had never been so thin. Modern scholars would later interpret his obsession through the lens of necrophilia and delusional attachment disorders, conditions fueled by unresolved grief and narcissistic fantasy. But in his time, no one had the vocabulary to name such darkness. Carl was simply the mad doctor, a relic of a century fascinated by the grotesque. Still, there was something hauntingly human about him. The same loneliness that drives people to pray to the dead, to keep ashes on nightstands, to speak to photographs long after the living voice has gone. Carl's sin was that he gave that grief a body, a face, and a place in his bed. In trying to defeat loss, he had made it immortal. His legacy became a warning whispered through the halls of dark history, that love without boundaries can become something monstrous, and that even the purest affection, when left to rot in isolation, will eventually decay into obsession. Carl von Cosel died alone in July 1952, at the age of 75. His body was found in a small, decaying cabin near Zephyrhills, Florida, a structure he had transformed into his own shrine. The windows were sealed, the walls lined with faded photographs of Elena, and in the center of the room lay a life-sized effigy of her likeness, pale, silent, dressed in bridal white. When authorities entered, they found Carl's body collapsed beside it, as if he had died mid-embrace. On his chest was a single rose, dried and brittle with time. No one knew how long he had been dead before he was found. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and withered perfume. On a table beside the effigy lay a note, written in his distinct, shaky handwriting. It read, "Darling, I am with you. Soon, we shall awaken together." Even in death, Carl's obsession refused to fade. His neighbors rarely saw him in his final years. Those who did recalled his hollow smile and the way he always carried flowers, speaking softly to someone who wasn't there. He had become a ghost in his own lifetime, haunting a house of memory, surviving only through his devotion to a woman long gone. When investigators moved his belongings, they discovered something even more chilling: a small music box that played Elena's favorite song. It was still wound, as though waiting for her return. After Carl's death, his story reignited public fascination. Newspapers once again splashed his name across headlines: the man who slept with the dead. Some wrote about him with pity, others with horror. His journals, filled with sketches and letters addressed to Elena, revealed a man who had completely lost his tether to reality. He described dreams in which she spoke to him, promising they would meet among the stars. Psychologists studying the case later suggested that Carl had succumbed to erotomania, a delusion that convinces a person that their love is reciprocated, even by the dead. But beyond the medical analysis, his story became something else entirely: a parable of loneliness, of what happens when love becomes an echo chamber. Carl's remains were buried far from Key West, yet the legend of his obsession lingers like the scent of embalming fluid, sweet, strange, and suffocating. Some say that on certain nights, when the wind passes over the Key West cemetery, you can still hear faint music drifting through the air, like an organ playing for a bride who never truly left. In the end, Carl von Cosel achieved what he always wanted. He and Elena were inseparable, not in life, but in memory. Their story remains one of the darkest romances ever recorded, a haunting reminder that the line between love and delusion can be as thin as a heartbeat. For Elena's surviving family, the reopening of her story after Carl's death was like ripping open a wound that had never healed. Her younger sister, Nana, who had once testified in court during the 1940 investigation, refused to speak of the man again. "He took more than her body," she once told a neighbor. "He took her peace." The family had tried for years to reclaim Elena's remains, but the authorities buried them secretly to prevent further desecration. No one, not even the Campillos themselves, were ever told the location. Still, the whispers persisted. Some said Carl had left behind directions hidden in one of his notebooks, that he knew where she rested and planned to reunite with her even in death. Others dismissed it as myth, the feverish imagination of those unable to comprehend such devotion. Yet among the old residents of Key West, stories continued to circulate. Late-night sightings of a gaunt man wandering near the cemetery, humming a lullaby, flickering lights in the mausoleum long after the gates were locked. For many, the case became more than a grotesque curiosity. It was a question about the human mind's fragile boundaries, about what grief can do when left untreated, when obsession masquerades as love. To some, Carl was a monster. To others, a tragic relic of a man consumed by loneliness in an age before therapy, before understanding. In the decades that followed, Carl von Cosel's name became both legend and warning. Writers, filmmakers, and psychologists dissected his story, each seeing something different in it: necromantic horror, romantic tragedy, or clinical madness. In Key West, tourists asked about the man who loved too much, while locals lowered their voices, as if uttering his name might summon his ghost. By the 1960s, the house where Elena had once lived was torn down, but fragments of her memory remained. An old photograph, a lock of hair preserved in an envelope, a name scratched faintly into a wall. Every trace carried a question. Could love ever justify what Carl did? Or was his passion proof that love, left unchecked, becomes its own form of decay? Even today, historians struggle with that paradox. In his diaries, Carl never expressed guilt, only longing. He believed death had freed Elena from pain, that he was her savior, not her captor. But perhaps the truest horror of this story lies not in what he did to her body, but in what he convinced himself was love. Carl's tale lingers because it forces us to confront an unbearable truth. Sometimes, obsession hides in the language of affection, and the greatest monsters are those who believe they are saving someone while slowly destroying them. After the scandal quieted, Carl von Cosel's story seeped into academic circles, whispered in lectures on abnormal psychology and forensic pathology. His case became a disturbing template for understanding necrophilic obsession and delusional attachment, two conditions barely explored in the early 20th century. Medical journals referenced him only in cautious language, describing his pathological fixation as a study in grief turned psychosis. But in quieter corners of discussion, some scholars asked a darker question. Had Carl truly believed he was restoring life, or had he simply redefined death to ease his own despair? Forensic scientists analyzed the preserved reports from 1940, astonished by the crude methods Carl had employed: makeshift embalming fluids, wires to maintain posture, glass eyes inserted where life had gone. It was horrifying ingenuity, the product of a mind that refused to accept loss. To Carl, every grotesque modification was not mutilation, but devotion. "I loved her enough to rebuild her." One of his diary lines read, a confession both heartbreaking and monstrous in equal measure. The medical world condemned him, but others found a perverse fascination in his methods. In post-war Europe, his name circulated in psychiatric casebooks, next to infamous figures of obsession and delusion. He became a symbol of the human mind's terrifying elasticity, proof that love, when detached from reality, can become indistinguishable from madness. As his legend spread, so did its influence on culture. Writers of Gothic and Romantic horror began to borrow from his life: the lonely man reviving a lost love, the decaying beauty preserved through forbidden science. Films, plays, and novels inspired by von Cosel's obsession reimagined his story with varying tones. Some painted him as a tragic lover who defied mortality, others as a corpse thief, a blasphemer who mistook possession for affection. But beneath every retelling pulsed the same question: where does grief end and delusion begin? Carl himself seemed to anticipate this legacy. In one letter discovered years after his death, he wrote, "They will make monsters of us both, but at least they will never forget our love." It was not pride, but prophecy. For in the decades that followed, his story endured precisely because it blurred moral lines, forcing each listener to choose between disgust and pity. Today, the case of Carl von Cosel remains more than a macabre tale. It is a haunting study in obsession's anatomy, how a man's yearning to defeat death became a slow erasure of the very person he loved. Elena Hoyos never had a voice in her story. Carl made sure of that. And perhaps that is the true tragedy, not that he refused to let her die, but that in doing so, he silenced her forever. In the years that followed, Key West became a quiet shrine to whispers. Locals avoided the old hospital where Carl had once worked, claiming strange flickers of light sometimes danced across the shutters at night, as if echoes of his experiments still lingered. Tourists began arriving in small numbers, seeking the grave of the girl who never died. Merchants even sold postcards of Elena's photograph, her face, young and luminous, immortalized in a way she never consented to. The story of von Cosel had transcended scandal. It had become folklore. And like all folklore, it shifted with every telling. Some said he had performed black magic. Others insisted he had made a deal with death itself, trading sanity for love. A few, more forgiving, saw him as a man too tender for the world, someone destroyed by grief in an age that understood only logic. Psychologists, however, drew darker conclusions. They described Carl's case as the ultimate example of objectified love, where the beloved ceases to exist as a person and becomes a vessel for fantasy. He didn't preserve Elena, they wrote. He preserved an illusion of her, one that obeyed him, never aged, never argued. That illusion was the comfort he couldn't find in life. In a time when faith and science wrestled for dominance, Carl had unknowingly created his own religion, worshipping the body as relic, the home as tomb, and his love as a god that demanded devotion beyond sanity. By the 1950s, Carl von Cosel had become a ghost of his own story. He lived alone in a small house near Zephyrhills, Florida, surrounded by instruments and papers, always claiming Elena's spirit visited him nightly. "She sits by my bed," he told a neighbor once, "and reminds me that death is only a door." His words unsettled those who heard them, not because of madness, but because he spoke with conviction. Even after all that had happened, Carl did not view himself as a criminal. In his eyes, he had only completed what love had started. When he died in 1952, his body was found lying beside a small effigy, a crude replica of Elena's form, sculpted from wax and silk. Neighbors said his expression was peaceful, as though he had finally joined her. Police noted a music box playing a faint waltz, its notes looping endlessly in the stale air. There was no family to claim him, no ceremony, only the faint hum of that tune. Yet, even in death, Carl remained a mirror for humanity's darkest desires, our need to hold onto what is already gone, to resurrect memory through possession. His madness was not born of evil, but of denial, a refusal to surrender love to the silence of the grave. And in that refusal, he became timeless, a relic of obsession, a warning that love unrestrained becomes its own form of death. The aftermath of Carl von Cosel's story rippled far beyond Florida's sunlit shores. Psychologists, theologians, and journalists dissected his life as if trying to exhume meaning from madness. What drives a man to such extremes? Was it love, illness, or something darker, an unholy fascination with death itself? For many, his actions represented the final descent of human longing, when devotion becomes desecration, when affection consumes morality. In classrooms, medical students debated his psyche. In churches, Preachers used his name as a sermon on sin and pride. But in whispered corners, others were less certain. Could it be that von Cosel's madness was only a reflection of something all too human? The desperate wish to conquer death, to make love eternal, no matter the cost? By the late 20th century, the story of Carl and Elena resurfaced in literature and film. Writers found in him the archetype of the modern necromancer, a man who blended technology, passion, and denial into a single act of blasphemous love. Artists painted Elena as a tragic muse, her beauty frozen by both romance and rot. Museums even displayed artifacts from the case, drawing crowds who peered through glass at the instruments he once used. Each visitor felt the same uneasy pull, revulsion mixed with pity, horror tinged with awe. They weren't looking at a monster. They were staring into the abyss of devotion taken too far. The ethical questions still echo today. Was Carl von Cosel a madman, or simply a man who refused to let the world dictate how he should grieve? His obsession forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about love and mortality. We honor those who die for love, but what of those who cannot let love die? His story blurs the line between romance and horror, exposing how easily the two can intertwine when emotion overrides reason. Decades later, psychologists coined new terms: pathological attachment, erotomania, delusional preservation. Yet none could fully capture the haunting simplicity of what von Cosel had done. He had taken the dream of eternal love and stripped it of all illusion, revealing its corpse-like truth, that permanence, when forced, becomes imprisonment. And perhaps that's why the legend of the boy who never died endures. It speaks not only of one man's madness, but of a universal hunger to hold on, to refuse endings, to outweep decay. In von Cosel's tragedy, humanity sees its own reflection, a reminder that even the most beautiful love, when untouched by death, begins to rot in the hands of the living. While history immortalized Carl von Cosel's obsession, Elena de Hoyos' story was largely erased, her voice smothered beneath his devotion. The woman at the center of this nightmare was remembered not for her laughter or her dreams, but for what was done to her after death. Her family, crushed by both grief and humiliation, could not escape the shadow his actions cast. In Key West, the Hoyos name became synonymous with tragedy. Strangers whispered when her mother passed on the street. Children pointed at the cemetery gates as if expecting to see a phantom bride walking beyond the iron bars. For years after Carl's trial, the Hoyos family avoided public life, choosing silence over spectacle. Her younger sister Celia, once outspoken, was said to suffer nightmares, visions of Elena's lifeless face beneath a veil, eyes open as if pleading for rest. Local gossip claimed the family had cursed Carl in secret, invoking old prayers against the man who defiled their daughter's peace. But even curses, it seemed, could not bring closure. The pain lingered in quiet ways, in unspoken sentences, in rooms where her portrait was turned to face the wall, in the slow erosion of faith. Elena became a story no one dared to tell aloud. Her life was reduced to a single word: victim. Yet those who knew her insisted she had been far more. A hopeful young woman with a voice that loved to sing, and dreams of a future she'd never lived to see. In later decades, historians tried to restore Elena's humanity. Archival researchers uncovered fragments of her life: a baptismal record, a love letter to a man who wasn't Carl, a photograph taken months before she fell ill. In these scraps, she reemerged not as a ghost or symbol, but as a young woman who had once dared to imagine something simple: love, marriage, music. Her tragedy, then, was not just what was done to her after death, but how her memory was stolen to glorify another's madness. Modern scholars began referring to her as the woman who never slept, a poetic reflection of how the world refused to let her rest. Even in documentaries and retellings, her name was often overshadowed by Carl's: the inventor, the necrophile, the man who loved too much. But in reality, her silence speaks louder than his story ever could. It reminds us that true horror doesn't always come from monsters. Sometimes, it's born from love that forgets to respect the dead. Elena's tragedy is the echo left behind when obsession claims ownership over another's soul. And through that echo, her spirit finally demands recognition, not as Carl's beloved corpse, but as the girl whose peace was stolen in the name of love. Decades after Carl von Cosel's death, his story began to take on a strange immortality. In universities and psychology journals, his name appeared alongside terms like thanatophilia and obsessive delusion. He was no longer merely a Florida eccentric. He had become a symbol of how grief, unchecked and untreated, can consume the soul. For medical historians, his case was a haunting study of obsession colliding with intellect. Here was a man of science who abandoned every principle of his profession in pursuit of love beyond the grave. He used his knowledge not to heal, but to preserve, not to save life, but to deny its ending. Ethicists debated whether Carl was a warning of what happens when human curiosity crosses into forbidden territory, the point where medicine becomes necromancy. The instruments he built, the concoctions he mixed, all were born from genuine scientific understanding. Yet each was turned toward an unspeakable purpose, to make the dead appear alive. Even now, psychologists see in his actions a metaphor for society's larger denial of death. In an age obsessed with beauty, youth, and permanence, Carl's twisted devotion mirrors the same impulse that drives us to cling to what cannot last. He was, in his own horrifying way, a reflection of the human refusal to accept loss. As decades passed, the line between fact and legend blurred. Some storytellers painted Carl as a tragic romantic, a man punished for loving too much in a world too cruel to understand him. Others depicted him as a monster, incapable of empathy, driven by control and possession rather than affection. Both versions, however, point to a truth far more unsettling, that within love lies the seed of destruction. When the desire to keep someone outweighs the respect to let them go, devotion becomes desecration. Films, novels, and plays inspired by the case began appearing throughout the 20th century. Each retelling changed the details but kept the same haunting core, the image of a man dancing with a corpse, whispering promises into hollow ears. Some saw it as psychological horror, others a cautionary tale about loneliness and obsession. To this day, the story resurfaces in pop culture whenever society revisits its own fears about death, love, and control. Carl von Cosel's legacy is not buried in a grave. It lives within us, as a dark reminder of how far the human heart will go to resist the silence of goodbye. Time has a cruel way of softening horror into legend. By the 1960s, the story of Carl von Cosel had already begun its slow transformation from crime to curiosity. In Key West, his name was whispered like a ghost tale told to tourists, a macabre attraction that blurred the line between tragedy and spectacle. Those who still remembered him described a man both brilliant and broken, his obsession haunting the same air he once filled with serenades to a corpse. For younger generations, the story became almost unreal. A man who built a mausoleum in his living room, who refused to admit death had taken the woman he loved. Yet behind the sensationalism, there lingered something deeper, something that touched the collective fear of every listener, the terror of losing someone forever. Historians began to re-examine Carl not merely as a perverse scientist, but as a symptom of a larger human sickness. His story unfolded during a time when death was more visible, yet less understood. Medical advances promised to conquer mortality, and yet grief remained unspeakable. Carl's creation, that grotesque preservation of love, was both his rebellion and his confession. He could not cure death, so he attempted to imitate life. In that act, he revealed what humanity has always struggled to accept, that love, when stripped of empathy and acceptance, becomes the most destructive form of denial. To the modern eye, the story feels both distant and disturbingly relevant. In a world driven by obsession, control, and the illusion of permanence, Carl von Cosel stands as an eerie prototype of modern madness, a man who blurred the line between devotion and delusion. We see reflections of his sickness in digital memorials, in the desperate attempts to immortalize faces through screens, in the refusal to let go of what time inevitably takes. Perhaps that is why his story endures, because it reminds us that grief, if unacknowledged, can twist even the most tender emotions into monstrosity. Carl's actions cannot be defended. They are unforgivable acts against life and dignity, but they force us to confront something uncomfortable within ourselves. What does it mean to love without boundaries? What happens when affection becomes ownership, when memory becomes obsession? The true horror of this story isn't in the corpse or the crime. It's in the mirror it holds up to humanity. Carl von Cosel may have lived nearly a century ago, but his madness is timeless, echoing through every era that refuses to let death have the final word. Years after Carl von Cosel's death, the name Elena Hoyos began to surface again, no longer just as the object of a madman's love, but as a woman who had been silenced by obsession. Journalists, historians, and feminists of the late 20th century revisited her tragedy with a new question. Who was Elena before she became a corpse? In life, she had been a daughter, a sister, a young woman with dreams of music and family, stifled by illness and poverty. Yet, for decades, her identity had been erased, replaced by the image of a man's fantasy. It was as though her memory had been held hostage in the same way her body had, bound, claimed, and rewritten. When her remains were rediscovered, authorities reburied her in an unmarked grave in Key West Cemetery, away from prying eyes and morbid curiosity. It was a gesture of mercy, but also a quiet act of restoration, to give Elena the peace she had been denied in both life and death. People began leaving flowers near her resting place, anonymous offerings of sorrow, as if apologizing for the decades of spectacle that had turned her suffering into entertainment. And with each retelling, more voices began to ask, why had the world chosen to remember his name and not hers? The rediscovery of Elena's story marked a turning point in how history treats victims of obsession. Documentaries, novels, and academic papers reframed the narrative, shifting the spotlight from Carl's grotesque romance to the violence of erasure itself. It was no longer just about one man's madness, but about society's willingness to romanticize control and call it devotion. Elena's silence became a symbol, not of passivity, but of what happens when women's stories are written by those who harm them. Even in her stillness, Elena Hoyos became a quiet revolution. The world that once mocked her tragedy now began to see it for what it was, a violation disguised as love, a crime disguised as grief. And in that recognition, her name found new life. Historians wrote of her dignity. Artists painted her not as a corpse, but as a ghost reclaiming her narrative. She had been voiceless once. Now her story spoke louder than the man who tried to preserve her forever. In the end, perhaps the greatest act of justice was not the punishment of Carl von Cosel, but the resurrection of Elena Hoyos's humanity. In the decades that followed, Carl von Cosel's story became a haunting case study in psychology classrooms and ethics debates around the world. Scholars described his obsession as a pathological form of romantic idealization, a tragic mixture of narcissism, grief, and delusion. To Carl, Elena was not a person but a vessel for his unfulfilled dreams. Her body became the canvas on which he painted his madness, mistaking preservation for affection. What disturbed researchers most wasn't just the act itself, but his complete lack of remorse. He spoke of her as if she had willingly chosen eternity with him, as if consent could exist beyond the grave. His delusion was so perfect, so total, that even when confronted by horror, he believed himself the hero of a love story misunderstood by society. But beneath the academic terminology lay something darker, a mirror held up to human longing. How far will someone go to deny loss? How easily can love, when poisoned by obsession, become indistinguishable from control? Carl's story forced people to confront a truth few wanted to face. that the boundary between devotion and destruction is far thinner than we imagine. Every generation that revisited the case found itself unsettled not just by what he did, but by how disturbingly human his reasoning sounded when spoken aloud. By the time the 20th century closed, the tale of Carl von Cosel had shifted from sensational tabloid horror to philosophical inquiry. Writers and filmmakers began to explore the story not for shock, but for its eerie commentary on loneliness, how isolation and unhealed grief can twist even the most tender emotions into monstrosity. Museums refused to display his reconstructed altar of love, calling it an artifact of cruelty, not devotion. Yet, his journals and letters remained preserved in archives, reminders of how easily obsession can masquerade as faithfulness. Psychologists compared his delusion to religious ecstasy, the same kind of blind worship that replaces reality with desire. Ethicists debated whether his act was insanity or ego, compassion or desecration. And yet, through all these discussions, one truth persisted. Elena had no voice in any of it. She never asked to be remembered this way. Her story remained a haunting reflection of how easily love can become imprisonment when one person refuses to let go. In that silence, she teaches us the most unsettling lesson of all, that even in death, one can be possessed by those who cannot bear to grieve. What makes the story of Carl von Cosel endure is not merely the grotesque image of a man sleeping beside a corpse. It's the quiet, unbearable loneliness that birthed it. Beneath the horror lies a fragile truth. Carl was not driven by lust or cruelty, but by an all-consuming fear of loss. In that fear, he crossed every boundary, moral, legal, and human, to preserve the illusion that love could defeat death. For him, decay was an enemy, not a natural end. So he fought it with silk and plaster, with perfume and promise, turning a coffin into a shrine and a body into a myth. His crime was not just the desecration of flesh, but the worship of an impossible dream. And yet, the deeper tragedy wasn't Carl alone. It was the silence that surrounded him. No one intervened when his obsession grew. No one looked closer when his grief turned strange. The small town of Key West watched, whispered, and dismissed him as eccentric. It's as if the world itself conspired to ignore the madness until it became too monstrous to hide. Even after his secret was revealed, he was treated with a strange sympathy, almost reverence, as though his love, however twisted, was something noble. That collective indulgence, that refusal to confront the sickness behind his devotion, became a horror in itself. Proof that society, too, can romanticize monstrosity when it wears the mask of love. When Carl von Cosel died in 1952, alone in a small rented room, he was found clutching a life-sized effigy of Elena, sculpted from wax and human hair. In his final journal entry, he wrote, "Love is eternal, and she waits for me beyond the veil." Those words, trembling with delusion and sincerity, remain one of the most disturbing epitaphs in modern history. Even in death, Carl believed that he had transcended morality, that what he felt was pure, divine, unbreakable. But perhaps the most haunting truth is that love, when stripped of boundaries and consent, becomes indistinguishable from madness. Today, Elena's remains rest in an unmarked grave somewhere in Key West, her true resting place kept secret to protect her from further violation. Carl's instruments, diaries, and photographs sit locked in archives, reminders that obsession, once sanctified, can outlive its host. The story of Carl and Elena endures not as a love story, but as a warning, a reminder that even the most beautiful emotions can rot when kept alive too long. For in trying to conquer death, Carl von Cosel became what he feared most, a ghost himself, haunting the edge between passion and ruin.